Today's meeting, of course, is related to the research strand of the initiative. In 2024, we took an important step in launching the Political Participation Policy Index, which is basically measuring policies along a set of indicators. And now we are taking another step and look into what actually are the effects of policies on participation outcomes, basically linking the index to statistical data. The purpose of this meeting is that we present the results, listen to the comments of participants, discuss it with you, take this feedback on board for the finalization of the report and the recommendations. The agenda for the next 1 hour and 50 minutes is first my colleagues will present results. Bashar Yafjan, Head of Research at MPG and leading this investigation, and Chiara Agrillo, a research trainee who has been heavily involved in the research. Then we have two excellent discussants with us. Thanks for joining us. Derek Hutchison from Malmö University. He's pro-dean of the Faculty of Culture and Society and professor of political science, who has worked extensively on electoral politics, transnational citizenship, electoral rights. Welcome. And then Zeynep Yanaşmayan from DESIM in Berlin, which is the German Center for Integration and Migration Research. She is head of the migration department, working on citizenship, mobility, transnationalism, and I have to add also member of the advisory board of our initiative. And then, of course, we will open the floor for questions and comments of all participants. So without further ado, I would say, Bashar and Chiara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's great to see this interest and this turnout in this analysis. Well, this entire research started with our desire to better understand the political participation of migrants, the policies surrounding that, national policies surrounding that in EU member states. And we're taking it a step further and looking at the particular implications of that on migrant participation. So the reason why we started working on this is because actually we have realized that as we were working on MyPEX over the years, political participation was one of the weakest points in policy surrounding integration policy. And we find it quite problematic because participation of migrants is essential for also more inclusive policies on all the other remaining 7 dimensions. So failing to secure a seat at the table basically means that they cannot have a say over more inclusive policies. So trying to better investigate and understand this weakest link, we wanted to look further. And we are also aware that political participation is the cornerstone of democratic governance and key dimension of integration. Migrants' political participation is also central to the debates on democratic legitimacy, representation, and democratic resilience. So despite all this, our data on MyPEX and our analysis of the literature already showed us that there is varying regimes of citizenship across the EU, different uneven practices, uneven policies surrounding voting rights, civic freedoms, and varying institutional practices. So we wanted to first understand this heterogeneity by better diagnosing the different policy frameworks. And so as a result, with this report, we hope to understand the relationship between these policies and the participation outcomes across the EU member states. And Chiara will tell you more about this, why 22, even though with our index we looked into 27 member states. It's because of the data gaps and limitations in the data selection, data availability in these countries. So in particular, we are going to be looking at how policies are linked to outcomes in the area of naturalization, electoral participation, also non-electoral engagement, as well as political attitudes, looking at available administrative data and survey-based indicators. So for the rest of the presentation, we're going to briefly talk about our contribution, the Political Participation Policy Index. I'm just going to remind you what it is, the index that we have launched last year, and the theoretical link between policy and outcomes. And we're going to discuss the data gaps in landscape, talk about our data and methodology, and share with you the preliminary analysis and findings, which will be concluded by recommendations based on our findings in the both for research in this area, but also policymakers. So we believe that there is strong data, strong evidence already demonstrating the impact of institutional and policy context in shaping political engagement. And we will be contributing to this by how this works in the area of migrant political participation. We are also proposing a newly developed index as a robust comparative measure of political participation frameworks. And we really hope that the way we are scratching the surface with this analysis will be further developed with better comparative analysis using maybe multi-level models. We are also contributing to the literature on political participation as a multi-dimensional process, extending beyond voting and including non-electoral engagement and more subjective dimensions. In terms of the political implications, we believe that more inclusive political participation frameworks are associated with higher engagement overall. But we also show that formal rights alone are not sufficient. And we show that with our results, and we support the argument that rights should be combined with active encouragement, civic education, and support for a migrant-led civil society, all of which make a full political participation of migrants possible. And finally, addressing the data gaps is essential for better diagnostics and policy development from the perspective of policymakers. And this is really an important remaining shortcoming as we see it. So remembering the political participation policy index, as we said, we realized with MyPEX that was the weak area, and we came up with a pilot index looking at 8 key dimensions of political participation, both conventional and non-conventional, with 29 indicators across 27 countries, measuring policies, practices, and outcomes. Outcomes we were doing now, policies and practices in particular. So, and we're doing this based on the first dimension is whether or not there is a national strategy to increase political participation with specific goals, monitoring mechanisms, budgets allocated, whether or not there are full political and civic rights through citizenship, what are the requirements for these, right to vote in elections for foreign citizens, for foreign residents, encouragement to vote through registration, through information campaigns, promotion of representation in political life, representation of migrant-led civil society. So we're not just looking at elections, voting behavior in that regard, enabling collective civic engagement, collective behavior. In this case, this could be protest, this could be membership in associations, and civic education for a diversifying society, which is more like a bottom-up approach in terms of political socialization. You can just click on scan the barcode. I don't know what's the right term here. Chiara, help me out here. Scan the barcode and access the report. The data of the scores for all 8 key dimensions across for 27 countries is publicly available, and the more you use it, the happier we would be for this nice wide dissemination. So if we were to look at the link between policy and outcome, there's a lot of evidence showing that political participation policies there are many reasons for which policies should be related to outcomes for both electoral and non-electoral forms. Political institutions and participation rules clearly structure migrants' opportunities and constraint for engagement, and they enable migrants' participation by strengthening their capacity to shape decisions affecting their daily lives, enhancing their sense of agency and engagement, and contributing to a stronger feeling of belonging in their country of residence. Here, naturalization and voting rights are essential as they shape access to conventional political participation, but also the rules of citizenship and residence, how inclusive they are, how many additional requirements there are. Hence, the citizenship and residence regimes define formal inclusion or exclusion from political life, also having an impact on political participation. Therefore, this is also something that we'll be looking at. Policies and institutional contexts signal recognition and membership in the political community and hence boost perceptions of belonging, institutional trust, efficacy, which are central to political engagement. Inclusive, and in the end, we believe that inclusive participation context can strengthen these perceptions, supporting political integration, and hence political participation and perceptions are mutually reinforcing. I'm kind of moving quickly into these parts to allow you to meet the results as soon as possible. But as we launched ourselves into into this big enthusiastic endeavor of linking the policies to the outcomes, we realized that there are some certain data issues, data challenges that are out there, and we'd like to share with you some of these and some recommendations in that regard as well. I'll leave the word to Chiara at this point.
Thank you. So yes, when we started to research about this topic, we thought about what would be an ideal data set to study migrant political participation. And that would be a data set that is comparable across contexts and countries, where the migrant population is clearly defined, that accounts for different migrant groups, but also that includes information on both electoral and non-electoral participation. And that includes large and representative samples of migrants. We noticed that there are several gaps in the administrative data side. There is a lack of harmonization in the data collection. There are differences in administrative systems. Some countries, for instance, include data on European Parliament elections, other only on county elections or national elections. It's very varied across countries. There are very different migrant definitions that are used. Some use the country of birth, others use more generally foreign background or not. Others only include EU citizens other than national citizens. So that is also very varied. And in general, there is a lack of non-electoral participation data and of subjective indicators, which, as Başak mentioned before, are very relevant to study migrant political participation. So data on elections and voting and representation is often not disaggregated by migration background and is available only for a small number of countries, which we can go more into details later on, and only for some election types. However, there are still some good practices examples. For instance, Sweden and Finland have a lot of administrative data on migrant political participation. They both include turnout data for different election types, and they disaggregate them for Sweden by Swedish-born or foreign-born, and for Finland by Finnish or foreign background, but for some election types also by citizenship. And both also have data on candidates. For Sweden, they have data for nominated, elected, and non-elected candidates for different election types, again disaggregated by Swedish-born and foreign-born. And for Finland, they have candidates and elected candidates data for different election type, Finnish and foreign background, but also language spoken, which was quite a singular case. So because of these administrative data gaps, survey data remain the primary source for comparative analysis, also because they include non-electoral participation and subjective dimensions. However, migrants are still often underrepresented, and voting behavior is typically self-reported, which might not be very accurate because people might lie on self-reporting voting behavior. So about the data that we actually use for this research, we use mainly the European Social Survey data because it provides a large sample that is comparable across countries, and because it covers multiple participation channels, so not only the electoral one, and that makes it well suited to study migrant political participation. We also include naturalization rates that are taken from the Eurostat in 2023. We covered 22 EU member states because for some countries where data were not available, these were Czechia, Romania, Luxembourg, and then two others that now I don't remember, but Denmark also, Malta. Yes, and Malta, yes, exactly. Thank you. And then for the unit of analysis, we focus on the country level. We aggregated individual migrant responses, but we define migrant as people that were foreign born, regardless of citizenship. So that's quite a broad definition, but that's the best we could do with the data we had. We use as our key independent variable the political participation policy index, but in some cases we use the specific dimension or indicator that is more directly related to the outcome that we wanted to analyze. Our dependent variables are the participation outcomes at the country level. As mentioned before, we used aggregated individual migrant responses into country means and proportions, depending on the variable. And we use a scatter plot with the country's index score and their participation outcomes, and checked for the Pearson's correlation. And we generated these scatter plots with RStudio. Then these are the participation outcomes variables that we used. So for naturalization, we used the share of foreign citizens who acquired citizenship. For electoral participation, the percentage of people who said they have voted in the last national election. For non-electoral participation, we include the proportion of individuals that have donated or participated in a political party or pressure group in the last year, the percentage that signed a petition, and the percentage that have taken part in a public demonstration. And finally, for the last dimension, we focus on attitudes toward politics and the political system. So we considered institutional trust, which we built as an additive index based on several trust measures, namely on the parliament, political parties, politicians, police, and the legal system. It takes the value of 0 when there is no trust at all, and 10 when there is complete trust, and it's a country mean. We also consider the sense of belonging, so how much individuals felt emotionally attached to their country of residence, and political efficacy, so how much individuals perceive that the political system they live in allows them to have an influence on politics.
So for the sake of time and to give you with a more succinct, to the point analysis, we actually looked over these relationships and built a table where we show you the relationships between the indicators as measured by the index and the particular outcomes that we're looking at and the correlations that we have found. After presenting you with these like summary tables, I'm going to go into the nice figures generated in R and show you how the different countries in the analysis have fared, have scored across these different dimensions and where they stand in the relationship. So the first set of results relate to naturalization rates, and we looked at naturalization rate against both the index, so how policies as measured by the index along all 8 dimensions are correlated with naturalization rates, and we found that there is a 0.47 correlation, which is for for the only 222 number of observations in this case, is quite nice to find a statistically significant result. Same goes with citizenship dimension of the index, which is the one that particularly looks at the requirements for citizenship. And here we see that actually the relationship is stronger, and there is a link between naturalization rates and citizenship policies both for EU citizens and non-EU citizens, albeit a stronger relationship for non-EU citizens. The second area we looked at was the attitudes. So here we looked at the institutional trust of migrants, an important variable largely studied and compared to the non-migrants within countries. And we already know that integration policies play a role in this, but if we were to take a step further and look into the political participation policies, they seem to play a role also. This is an index variable that includes all kinds of national institutions into the final score. And then we looked at the political efficacy. That is to say, an individual's, a migrant's belief that he or she can have an influence over policies. And this is an important variable in comparative voting behavior that is looked at to understand political all kinds of political behavior, both conventional and non-conventional, because a lot of times it is because people do not have efficacy and they do not believe that they can impact outcomes that they do not participate. And in this case, also, we find a statistically significant relationship between the political participation policy index, indicating that inclusive policies surrounding political participation are closely linked to stronger feelings of efficacy among migrant populations. We did find also a relationship between sense of belonging and political participation. We're reporting this because in case the statistical non-significance is rooted in the small number of observations, it is worth noting that there was a relationship. The second set of results relate to first electoral participation. And for electoral participation, we actually disentangled the index along the dimensions, and we looked at the three particular dimensions, and those are citizenship, rights to vote, and encouragement to vote. And you can see the results here, especially with encouragement to vote dimension, we found a strong relationship, and which is something we were expecting, and it really supports the position that it is not just about citizenship regimes, but also the policies surrounding support and encouraging migrants to vote, such as registration, such as information dissemination, that plays a high role in electoral participation. With the other the right to vote is also positively correlated with electoral participation, but the relationship is not statistically significant. If we were to move to non-electoral participation, we can see that with the two outcomes, so to say, potential modes of participation in political parties and pressure groups is strongly correlated with political participation index, and so is signing a petition even more strongly correlated with the index itself. There is a positive relationship between participation in a public demonstration and the freedom of expression dimension, but the relationship is not significant. Now, we have selected a few figures for each of these dimensions, and I'll be sharing them with you. So this is the particular citizenship dimension from the index, one of the 8 dimensions, and how it is linked to naturalization rates for EU citizens. And you can see the countries are actually closely aligned around the correlation line, and we can see that the relationship seems to be intact. In Hungary, there is a different relationship pattern, which may have to do with the specific migrant group in question. And then where we also see that stronger policies on citizenship require in terms of requirements are closely linked to naturalization rates. Where this relationship is even stronger for non-EU citizens, as you can see, and here for countries that have higher requirements on citizenship, such as Bulgaria, Austria, Hungary, the naturalization rates are low, whereas in countries with less requirements, such as Belgium, Finland, Sweden, Portugal, the rates are a lot higher. And the other area that we have looked at was the trust dimension, whether or not the index is linked to trust. And you can also see how the 22 countries are distributed. What you can see is that there's a strong link, which is evident with countries like Denmark, Portugal, Estonia, Sweden, and Ireland, which exhibit actually higher trust among migrants. They generally perform exceptionally well in our political participation index indicators on civic education, representation of migrant-led civil society, promotion of representation in political life, which may contribute to building greater trust among migrants. And the next one we looked at was political efficacy. Again, agency is closely linked to political efficacy, which is one's belief and ability to influence policy effectively. And here, what is remarkable is that actually the range of political efficacy variable is low, as only 3 countries have scored above 2.5, where the highest score could go all the way up to 5. This would indicate a systematic perception across Europe that migrants have limited influence over politics in the host countries. Countries like Bulgaria, France, Hungary have limited policies that protect the right to vote for citizens in elections, also limited representations of migrant-led civil society, which may lead to low efficacy, whereas the usual suspects, again, the countries that were indicated in the previous figure also fare very well on average political efficacy of migrants that they are hosting. Well, when we move to encouragement to vote dimension, this is something that we really wanted to mention, whether be it through dissemination of information on how to vote, be it through automatic registration procedures of migrants. Actually, these policies seem to have an impact on average voting turnout, as self-reported by migrants. And in countries where these avenues do not exist, these policies, these encouragement does not exist, even when the naturalization rates are higher, you can see that the average turnout seems to be negatively affected by this. And then the index, we looked at the index and participation or donation to a political party and pressure group. I believe this is the final graph that I am sharing with you. And here we are also seeing a strong relationship between the 2 variables. So we can also say policies seem to have an impact on migrants' behavior in participating in a political party or donating to a political party. This is, of course, these should be taken in conjunction with the other forms of political action, such as protest behavior, such as membership in other forms of organizations. But still, those countries that score high on the index are also those where migrants participate more in donating to a political party or a pressure group. I believe I have given you the overall findings in that higher scoring countries on the index tend to have higher naturalization rates, higher levels of institutional trust and political efficacy. The results on electoral participation is a bit more mixed, but here we're really emphasizing that policies encouraging voting are strongly associated with higher migrant voter turnout. And voting rights and favorable citizenship policies alone do not consistently translate into higher electoral participation. And positive association between inclusive policy frameworks and non-electoral activities also is important to show. Here, what we want to propose is actually doing more research with these indicators, as we have shown some preliminary results into how they seem to matter when it comes to migrant political participation, actual migrant political participation. But we also have important recommendations when it comes to the policies. And I will start with the first one, which is what we have found when we were developing the political participation index is that there's very strong link between having a good strategy and scoring well in the index. So, which was one of the dimensions of the index. So clearly defined objectives of what migrant political participation should be like, dedicating a budget to it, identify which institutions are responsible, how it will be monitored, how migrant political participation is evaluated, and these policies surrounding migrant political participation is evaluated is really critical. Secondly, lower structural and administrative barriers to citizenship is very important, and we believe that this point is very important amid the increasing requirements for citizenship across the world, across the EU in particular. And despite the trend, we're going to insist on reducing the requirements, shortening the waiting periods, and improving the transparency, and providing legal and administrative support. And if there are additional requirements, really making sure that there's equitable access to the means to achieve those requirements, because more inclusive citizenship regimes tend to be also promoting more participation. Number 3 is expanding voting rights to migrants and providing avenues for meaningful participation, automated and simplified voter registration, clear and multilingual information on registration, equal access to infrastructure and information is also important. Prioritizing encouragement to vote, targeted voter outreach campaigns, local authorities, migrant organizations, leaders' engagement in these campaigns, and inclusive campaigns for vulnerable groups could be a good avenue. Strengthening civic education for diversifying society through promoting inclusive civic education into school curricula, adult civic education programs, combining institutional information with practical knowledge, and partnering with civil society actors in doing these through promoting community-based civic learning is also very important. One area that is also in some decline is migrant-led civil society, especially in the form of consultative bodies. We believe that support for migrant-led civil society is an essential part of political participation, especially given that more traditional forms of engagement, such as voting, is still out of reach of many migrants that have not yet naturalized. Stable and multi-year funding for these institutions, ensuring funding does not discourage advocacy or political expression, migrant organizations' access to policy making, and also capacity building for migrants in leadership, political advocacy, policy advocacy, and organizational sustainability are critical. With these, I leave it to Chiara for the final recommendations.
Yeah. Thank you. So another one concerns the protection and expansion of a civic space to ensure collective participation rights. So what this means is safeguarding freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, removing barriers to migrant participation in protest unions and advocacy groups, and also ensure that the public authorities' engagement with protests and civic mobilization is active rather than being actively discouraging it. Then the next one concerns migrant representation in the political and institutional life. So political parties should ensure inclusive recruitment and candidate selection practices. Mentoring, leadership, and training programs for candidates with migrant backgrounds should be ensured. And the legal and administrative barriers for standing for election should be reduced when possible. Also, it's very important to ensure diversity within public administrations and advisory bodies. The next 2 recommendations concerns the data gaps that we mentioned before. So the first one is filling these administrative data gaps by collecting and publishing disaggregated data on political participation, harmonizing the definitions of migrants to ensure cross-context comparability, expand administrative data collection to include different forms of participation outcomes, and also ensure that sensible data is protected and not misused. The next one is about being able to combine this administrative data with survey data. So combining administrative records with high quality survey data, supporting oversampling of migrant population in large-scale surveys, but also encouraging longitudinal data collection so that it's possible to track participation trajectories over time. And then finally, migrant political participations should be embedded in broader democratic governance agendas, which means mainstreaming participation objective into democracy, rule of law, and equality strategies, recognize migrant political participation as a driver of democratic legitimacy and resilience, and also frame political inclusion as an investment in social cohesion and democratic sustainability.
Well, at last, we'd like to thank the entire research team at MPG who was involved with collecting this data along with my picks, and also our project coordinator, Alexander Wolfard, so Sinem Yilmaz, Stefano Dodati, Thomas Huddleston, of course, for his generous support and consultancy throughout this period, Şebnem Kerzi, Costanza Hippolyti, Mariana Giorgerino, and Anna Igranisi. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions and additional reflections from our two reviewers, of course.
Okay, thank you for your very detailed presentation. And also thank you for highlighting all the issues around data gaps and data availability, which was a very important part of this research. Maybe Derek, first, I understand you have to leave a little bit earlier. What are your observations, comments?
Okay, well, thank you, first of all, to Bashak and Alexander and everybody else involved in the process for the invitation to be put with you today. It's always interesting to see the research that you're doing at MPG, and of course we've worked together in the past through various EU-funded projects, amongst others, one that we had a few years ago called Fair EU, where we were trying to map the electoral participation of migrants across the EU states. So it's extremely interesting to see that you've come much further since then in terms of mapping the rights and facilitated participation across the continent. And thank you also, I think you perhaps contacted me because at the moment in Malmö University, we're running a project for the Swedish Research Council, which is about the electoral participation of migrants in Swedish elections. And as you correctly pointed out, we're very lucky in Sweden from a research perspective that we have very detailed data on the entire electorate and their electoral participation, and can therefore map out in a great deal of detail the different groups who participate to higher and lower levels. So I think your important focus is then on filling in the gaps in the MyPEX analysis, the focus that you highlighted at the beginning, Bashak, on political participation. And I think maybe if we can couple that to something you said at the very end, which is that this can be embedded in a broader discussion about democratic agendas, because I think those of us who are researching this question, we sometimes have a tendency to look at in isolation the electoral participation of migrants and see it perhaps even from a slightly normative perspective that it's a good thing in general. I think most of us see that facilitation is put in place to try and encourage democratic participation, but we perhaps sometimes forget what's the reason behind that, and that is that in a continent of mobility, I'll come to the definition you use of new Europeans in a minute, but if we focus first of all on mobile EU citizens for a start, we focus on the fact that there are democratic rights that perhaps get lost as economic rights are used as people move around within the continent. And that there are also broader questions about people who settle in other countries, perhaps those who've been displaced and find a new home elsewhere, or even those who've moved for economic reasons, but who contribute to the economy in the countries that they're living in. And in all these cases, there's a danger that part of the resident population of a country who are perhaps long-term settled and contributing in many other ways to society lose the right to participate in politics as a result of having moved from one country to another. So I think you're therefore right to highlight integration not only as a question of societal resilience and so on, but also as a democratic issue. And in particular, the danger that certain groups are underrepresented in democratic processes compared with others. So therefore, I think it's important that you've tried to disaggregate this question to look at 8 different dimensions of participation and not just focus in specifically on what we looked at in the project I mentioned earlier, which is electoral participation, but see that electoral participation is part of a bigger package of rights and obligations that come in one case with citizenship and in other cases with residence and with contributions to society and with simply being in a society. And I think also one of the things that I'm commenting perhaps slightly on the analysis you've just done and also on the index you've constructed here, that you try and make a distinction between the rules and the rights on the one hand and the practice and the application of them on the other. As we saw in previous projects, it's one thing to have electoral rights. It's another thing to actually use those rights or to be able to use these rights if it's complicated to register, for instance, or if there are difficulties in understanding the political system or being able to get to vote and so forth. So I commend you, therefore, for the amount of research you've done to try and compile this. I know from past experience that trying to compile comparable data for in this case, 22 countries is always a labour of love, and you're to be commended for having managed to track down a lot of this information from different sources. And also for highlighting the data gaps, because particularly when it comes to formal electoral participation, a lot of this information is not kept even at national level, it's kept at local level, and often you have to try and aggregate together many different sources of information and then take account of different national methodologies and different degrees of accuracy in collecting it to be able to put it all together into a bigger picture. And as I said, we in Sweden are very lucky to be able to access electoral data right down to the level of individual people, but in most countries, that data is lacking or disaggregated or simply not there in the first place. So perhaps if I turn to your findings next, I think it's also interesting to see that there was a few outlying states when it came to naturalisation relative to the facilitation of it. And I noticed in particular that 3 of the states that jumped out, as you highlighted in your presentation, were Hungary, and then Estonia and Latvia. I also noticed were 2 of the others. And of course, the interesting thing about those is that the groups of non-citizens are not necessarily immigrants. In some cases, they're people who've actually spent their entire lives in the country, but hold the citizenship of another country, or in the case of Latvia and Estonia, in some cases don't hold any citizenship at all. So it was interesting to see that within your data, you picked up on the fact that these states, which have slightly different situations from the others, where primarily we're looking at immigration, also had different outcomes. I thought also it was interesting that you found that citizenship was insignificant. I can't now remember if I've made a note saying citizenship insignificant, precisely what the relationship you found there was, but I remember in the chart that you showed that came out as being insignificant. And that then maybe switches me over a little bit to some of the methodological questions that I had about, first of all, the index, and secondly, the survey data you combined with it. So the first one, methodologically, is to say, are all these 8 aspects independent of each other? And that's perhaps something to think about, that, for example, the naturalisation question is connected to some extent to how easy or difficult it is to naturalise, and in turn, sometimes electoral rights are connected in an indirect way with how easy or difficult it is to naturalise, because in some cases, like the Baltic states, electoral participation rights to some extent compensate for the lack of easy citizenship acquisition. And in other cases, such as Ireland, for example, the relatively wide electoral rights are complemented by, or Sweden perhaps is a better example here, complemented by relatively easy naturalisation paths compared to other countries. So I think perhaps a little bit about how independent these 8 aspects are. And then when it comes to combining that with the ESS data, if I picked up correctly on what you said, Chiara, you either couldn't make a distinction because of the data or weren't able to make a distinction between citizens and non-citizens when it came to picking up on the foreign-born groups within the ESS data. And that, I think, is a very important distinction in the case of electoral rights, because if your dependent variable is electoral participation in national elections, what you're potentially looking at is two different groups of people, some of whom could vote and don't, and others of whom are excluded from voting by virtue of not being citizens in the first place, which for the majority of EU states, with a couple of minor country-specific exceptions, is going to be the case for all the national level elections and not so much for the local ones. So you're limited, I think, by the data and the questions and the surveys, but that's perhaps something to consider there. I thought also it was interesting you picked up on the fact that there was a significant relationship, as far as I understood, between participation in informal political activity and the index, because I think that's also speaks to the literature that we know from a lot of other studies, that these again are not independent of each other, that voting isn't something you just suddenly waking up and do one day. It's something that's usually part of a broader package of being involved in politics more generally, and that might include participating in informal things, going to meetings and demonstrations, signing petitions, or just generally talking about politics or being involved in civic society more generally. So I'm aware that time is running a little bit here, so maybe just to conclude with a few points here. Some of the weak relationships you find may be down to some of these questions about the multicollinearity between the different aspects of the data. But I think you're right, and it's very good here that you're putting a big focus on the fact that political participation can be seen both as an input and an output of integration processes. So political participation, as you highlighted in one of the texts you sent me, often can be a stepping stone towards broader civic integration, and in some cases even citizenship is a step after participation. And one of the studies that we're trying to do within our Swedish Research Council project is to try and establish in more detail the relationship between acquiring citizenship and starting to vote. In other words, whether people who are generally civically minded and civically interested are both interested in becoming citizens and in voting and in participating more generally in politics, or whether the process of acquiring citizenship in turn awakens some sort of interest in politics more generally, which leads in turn to participation. So whether it's a two-step linear process or whether it's two separate things feeding off the same general civic engagement. And second and thirdly, maybe just to finish off, coming back to where you started, I think this is a question about democratic engagement more generally, and perhaps comes a little bit back to the question of who should be able to vote, who is able to vote, and who actually does vote. And we perhaps sometimes conflate these three questions together to simply regard voting as an indicator of civic engagement or not. But these are three, particularly when it comes to migrants in a broader sense, these are three things that are often one step that leads to the next. And I think you're very good to highlight that aspect. And then very, very finally, perhaps just the overall topic or title here, New Europeans. I thought it was interesting that you grouped together all people who've migrated in some way across Europe as New Europeans, whether they originated in one EU country and moved to another, or whether they came from outside the EU, or whether they leave the EU. So I'm not sure if necessarily everybody is a New European, because some people were Europeans already, and some may feel more or less European than they used to. But it's an interesting concept to group everyone together under that label. So thank you for inviting me, and I won't take up any more time so that Zeynep also has a chance to comment.
Okay, thank you so much. Başak, do you quickly want to respond on a few
No,
points?
I just thank you so much, Derek. I mean, those are some of the points you raised were big challenges for us too when we were looking at each other about your comment on foreign-born, for instance, and voting in elections. It's really we even considered looking at whether or not we can break down the data, looking at where people were born, whether, and for some cases, it's even not possible to differentiate between EU and non-EU. But lucky, I mean, so that remains a challenge. So this is, despite all the caveats, this is what we found basically. It's not perfect at all. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to mention that this is indeed something that we discussed a lot when trying to to figure out how to define migrants. And when we included only migrants from the ESS data, the data set more than halved. And so we thought that there would be really this trade-off between trying to figure out how precise we could be in defining migrants and how many data we could lose because of this. Also because there's also a certain aspect of very large differences between migrants that are or migrants or foreign-born population that responded between the different countries. For some countries, there was a huge amount of respondents. For others, no. And so yes, there is this trade-off always between trying to figure out what is relevant to keep, where it is relevant to be more precise, and where
yeah, I mean, oversampling of migrants and more specific demographic record of them is also necessary. So that's just one thing I wanted to mention, and we'll definitely take into consideration your other remarks. In the index, we actually take into consideration the background, and we differentiate second generation, third country national, and the EU citizens, EU migrants. So actually it is possible to break it down as such and do the analysis, do the scoring, redo the scoring based on these specific groups. And for instance, just do the analysis for second generation. Could we have a way to filter those citizens from the European Social Survey, basically? But maybe for the EU, that can be possible for the future steps. Thank you so much for your directions on this.
Anyway.
Okay, thank you so much. Zeynep?
Okay, thank you very much. I kind of regret paying the second one because most of my points have been already said by Derek. This is so unfortunate, but I'll do my best to try to say something interesting nevertheless. But let me start also by first of all, praising the index and the report as such. I mean, I think it's very important. I mean, I think for all of us who worked with MyPEX before, it was very clear that the political participation dimension needs to be expanded. I'm very happy that you guys took that step and really went beyond this, you know, sort of narrow definition of political participation being only electoral participation and have this 8 dimensions. Which is really good. And I also really appreciated, kind of felt outside of the box when looking at policy dimensions, usually that you have the civic education for a diversifying society as a dimension, because I think it's very important to recognize it takes 2 to tango. So it was great to see that a measure that's addressed a larger sort of public than just purely migrants. Of course, this is also the hardest one, I'm assuming, to measure in terms of the outcome, so we don't see it as much in the report as such. Nevertheless, I think it's important to signpost this, right? So I really appreciated that. And I mean, again, Derek already mentioned, I think there's not enough praise is there for cross-country comparative data. I mean, that's just something huge that we don't come across very easily. I mean, we do have in Germany also kind of different types of databases. We have our own DETSIM panel, for instance, where we also have oversampled migrants who have some, you know, reliable survey data on these things. But still, I mean, I think this, the sort of scale of it is unbelievable, and it will be very useful for the academic community and beyond. It was a very rich report, and I had really hard time picking up what aspects that I should, you know, bring out more. So I will try to stick to 5 points, hopefully. And I'll start with being the devil's advocate. I guess it's clear enough that I really appreciate the project and the report as such. But I was just wondering, you know, in a world where we have stagnating autocratization and decreasing engagement in traditional forms of politics at large, turnout rates are decreasing. I was like, are we like migranticizing our political disengagement problem? This is a larger problem. Why are we focusing on migrants? Again, this is being devil's advocate. I know where you guys are going with it, but I think it's worth thinking about this in the larger context. And concretely, what this could mean also for the report, sometimes when I was reading about this, and obviously not the indicators or dimensions that are very specifically geared towards migrants, like naturalization rates and stuff, but political trust, right? Institutional trust, or political efficacy, to what extent people feel that what they're, you know, say can be is taken into account, or like, you know, signing, I mean, a lot of these different types of political activities. I always wondered, what is a general trend? Where do the, you know, non-migrant population stay there? And I thought it would be much stronger if you could, for some of them, not all, also indicates where the general value is and how close we are. I mean, if you take the very classical definition of political integration, it's this gap being smaller, right? It's like the migrant population coming closer to this general trend. So then it made me wonder, like, maybe we should, have that in here so that we can judge this better. Then, of course, what I've seen also in the chat, one of the points, like, it's also, of course, a lot of this migrant gap discussion that we have a lot to do with our gaze being very much focused on the country of residence. And we don't take enough account of transnational political activity, right? The fact that someone is not active politically in the country of residence doesn't mean that this is not a political person, right? It might be directed towards other channels. And that's something that we don't obviously take enough into account, right? Then maybe just to talk a little bit about some of the policy outcomes, I picked 3 here. One is undeniably with my interest is the one on naturalization rates, which I find obviously to be very interesting. And I wondered, I understand within the frame of this report that's not might be, but I think maybe more depth can be brought into it in explaining these results, with the different results, right? EU, non-EU, when we think about this, but I think also Derek hinted at this as well. This framework of intention, dissecting intention and ability, right? I mean, so the change in policies might be differentially affecting sort of EU and non-EU groups, right? I think for the non-EU groups, it affects their ability to basically become a citizen. If you have a 10 years residence with completely insecure legal statuses, it might be very difficult to reach there, right? So it's affecting that end of the decision making. So obviously, if it comes with sort of campaigns and nicer messages and all of that, it also impacts on the incentive side. But I think it's most the case for the EU citizens, basically, that this intention is much more affected by the facilitations of possible. And for the EU, non-EU, it's more the ability part that is being affected. So maybe that brings some sort of explanation into the different results that you're seeing between EU and non-EU migrants. Then I don't even know the number. This was also mentioned now by Derek, is I think I would problematize the relationship that you establish between electoral and non-electoral forms of political participation. I certainly do not believe this is a zero-sum game. And I can think of 3 different reasons, right? One is something that you don't actually look at, which might be seen. I understand that this the data problem. We know from the literature, particular participation in ethnic associations, right? Sort of diaspora organizations and all of that is the first step of electoral participation. So there's one model basically that could see this as sort of sequential steps. Alternatively, again, what's mentioned, a person can be political through different channels, can be active in, but doesn't mean, if you go to a protest, doesn't mean you don't vote, or if you can vote, then you won't go to a protest any longer. And I think a third thing that comes with that is, particularly given the political environment that we have now, increasing criminalization of migration, I truly believe people feel safer to go to protests once they are naturalized, right? And when their, migration status cannot be retrieved through being in a type of protest. So I think there's also, I think the relationship is not the way you formulate it in the report. And last thing that I want to come to is on voting rights and voter turnout. I think it's interesting that the relationship seems to be pretty puzzling, so to say. One thing that I was thinking about that here, particularly for this outlier cases that you have, like Bulgaria and Latvia, where generally the conditions are not very, so to say, favorable, but you still have higher turnouts. And I wondered if there's an effect of existence of minority parties here. So people feel drawn to vote for these parties regardless of the general framework conditions for, voting rights. And then it made me also think about, in general, something that you mentioned on your 8th recommendation about, I think that would be a good step to look at also migrant origin candidates. To what extent that's become something that sort of attracts people to vote. And obviously, if we go there, it's important not to sort of conflate descriptive and substantial representation, because I think this is something that we have I mean, the latter is obviously more difficult to measure, but it's more important for actual migrant interests being represented at the political level. And I think it is becoming increasingly blurry because pretty much all parties have their token migrants in their sort of ranks to claim representation, whereas the actual interest, whether the actual interests are represented or not, is another. So it is a very muddy water, so to say, to go in potentially quantitatively in this, but I think this would be also something to do. And I think I'll stop here, given that we don't have otherwise time for general discussion. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for these very rich and detailed comments. Bashak, when you respond, maybe you can link it to this one question that we have in the chat box, because you mentioned it. I'm curious to know whether you considered adding a variable on whether the respondents participated in political processes in their home countries in order to add nuance to the reasons for political participation and behavior in host countries. I think that is a very interesting aspect.
Yep, sure. Thank you so much, Zainab, for all this feedback. And Derek, I know that you need to leave at some point, so please feel free to leave at your convenience. Your input was quite instrumental for our understanding, and thank you very much.
Many thanks, and I need to go and chair a meeting, unfortunately, so I may just jump off at this point. But thank you for both your presentation and also to Zainab for her comments, which I think fitted together a bit with what I said previously. And I wish you the rest of the seminar to be pleasant as well.
Thank you. So for us, when we started the analysis and tried to identify the variables, one issue we had was exactly all of these other factors that could impact participation, which we try to acknowledge in the report and try to basically say that we are just looking, in addition to all these other factors, could political participation policies have an impact on these? And what is the right way of doing this is probably a multi-level model where you look at the actually link the individual data to individual data, basically, of the ESS and with using ESS. And looking at whether or not people have voted in the past, looking at whether or not how their trust diverges from the average trust in that country, right? You know, in terms of the difference of trust that you've indicated, plays a role. And just putting in the higher level variables, the policy variables at the national level. So that is the ideal way of doing this. For us, it was just scratching the surface, trying to see. We invite you all using the data with us or without us and produce these outputs using this index for sure. And with trust, we really discussed this a lot, right? Whether or not we should compare it with, because trust is affected by so many other national contextual things. But then we decided not to complicate it at this level and take it from there for the future work. Well, there are multiple results looking at the home countries, whether or not people's engagement in politics in back home actually leads to more engagement. From what I remember, it can be both ways. If this engagement has resulted in very conflictual engagement ways, political tension. In the case of refugees, for instance, in their origin countries, they may become kind of apoliticized and, you know, not to be involved in anything in their new country now, just to stay away from conflict to arise again because of this bitter taste in their mouth, so to say. But it can also mean that because they have been once involved, activated as active citizens, they may also become more politically engaged. These are definitely important variables. So are individual level variables, right? So is socioeconomic variables, and also so are institutional variables, whether or not voting is compulsory, whether or not, in the case of Hungary, not just the population that lives there that is a minority, but also here the naturalization rates also speak to those Hungarians that have ancestral citizenship, right, Zainab? So it's also here we're not really talking about migrants' political behavior. So, but so our goal was really to show that despite all of this, and despite the very small number of observations, we still find that there seems to be an impact. So let's use this index more, is just our point here. And all of this input is super useful, and we're gonna we hope to work on this closely. Maybe we can take a few more questions before we end. And I want to also call everyone to take a look at the a little bit self-promotion for our participants, but very meaningful self-promotion in the chat box about their reports. We have one entry from Voicify. We have another one. We have another one from Diaspora Vote, and we have an announcement from Stephen Swift from European Social Survey that a new round with a special module on migrants is coming up. I see Thomas has a question. Shall we go ahead with you? And then Genevieve and Vali.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. This is great to see these results, and I'll be happy to have the report in my own work here in Brussels. They don't see that they're not doing this kind of voter outreach and the effect that it has on voter turnout, right? So I think that all of us can use this data. And I'm really glad that you have ideas of how to expand it, because often people have been pooling European Social Survey results over several years so that you can do that kind of multivariate analysis of the individual, general, contextual factors, and then you can disaggregate for non-EU or discriminated groups or based on people's level of political participation in their home country. I wondered if you had any ideas for how you could continue to build on these results. It's great showing how relevant the political participation index is. But I thought about Derek's comment that there isn't a lot of harmonized data on voter turnout. Is this something that you guys would be interested in? And also to Zainab's comment that people are forgetting why immigrant political participation is good for democracy. Have you thought about looking at how political participation policies and outcomes for immigrants is also linked to the health of democracy, right? About whether having these policies and outcomes leads to or is part of having a generally high political trust, high political participation, high responsiveness from politicians, because I think that would help us in some way to show why we need to have this immigrant political participation to keep our democracies afloat. I wondered what next steps you were thinking then in terms of ways of using the index.
Thank you, Thomas. Maybe we can collect all of the questions at first. Genevieve?
Yeah, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. And mine, it has to do with knowing very well that political participation enables democratic integration process of immigrants. So the question leads me here, between immigrant and host country, which of these two people benefit from integration? Okay, and then what do policymakers how do policymakers ensure that there's two-way integration process? And in your survey that you carried out, did you also get a view of the political parties if they have any policy regarding immigrant political participation? Thank you.
Thank you. Vali?
Hi. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and for the great work that you have done. My name is Ahmad Wali. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Krems and at the VUB. I'm also the president of the Umbrella Refugee Committee in Brussels. There are a lot of food for thought and a lot of great outcome from this initiative. But I had a few reflections because throughout the presentations, we kept hearing a lot about data, about the different kinds of data that exist and that does not exist. Personally, for me, my PhD was on migration data and statistics. And I was just thinking about the fact that maybe in the recommendations that you had, perhaps one of the recommendations could be to put a bit more qualitative research to understand what's going on behind those numbers and behind those data. Because recently I did a research in Belgium on the political participation of refugees, people with a refugee background. And there was quite a lot of interesting outcomes. For example, one of the things was that some of the refugees changed political parties 3-4 times. And that says a lot because that kind of explains the decision making, how migrants see and understand migration in a general context, and what makes people to change their political opinion quite that often. And also another thing that have been discussed also is we mentioned several times about the trust issues, but I think when we study and when we talk with the political candidates, with people who are politically active with a migration background, there are many other challenges, and there are also many other indicators that kind of prevents people or challenges people into their political activities. So I think I would be happy to discuss this a bit more, but these are a few thoughts that I thought, because I know that the time is almost over. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Wally. Maybe I can turn to Chiara for the first set of responses, and I will follow up the missing ones. Yeah,
I will try my best. So with regards to the expansion of this kind of research, I think that there is a lot that we can do. There is let's say, more in depth that we can go in by including more variables, try to see what contextual factors matter in this relationship. And also what we notice also by evaluating what was done in previous literature is that there's a lot of mixed findings as well. There is not, let's say, very unidirectional findings. It's the case for sense of belonging, for example. It can be that sense of belonging makes you want to participate into the political life more, but it can also be that by participating more, then you feel that you belong to a certain country more. So it's, let's say that this research was really a first step into trying to understand the association between certain variables, but there is a lot to do. I think that for what concerns expanding the data retrieval from the different administrative sources that we found at the country level, I think that's very complicated still. I think that there's a lot that is missing to be able to actually aggregate them into a consistent way. But at the same time, I think it could be very useful to, in the next months or years, to use newer data, also because institutional practices and laws that exist might have some time to actually be able to be translated into practical outcomes. We did what we could now with the data that we have, that is as recent as 2023. But let's see that having longitudinal data would also be very useful to go deeper into this research.
And I can just give the good news that we will be collecting more data. We'll be conducting a second round of the political participation index and see, and we expect, especially with the current debates on citizenship and already legislation changes, some of these scores to change for some countries. So this way there could be some temporal comparisons that can be done. In an ideal world, policies come first and then come, I mean, you take a policy score of a year and then an outcome of 5 years later, 3 years later, to see the impact of policy, just also to establish causality in a better way. But at this point, the latest survey we could access was the same year as pretty much the same year as our index. But maybe now with the new European Social Survey being released, we can link it better with the past data, and then we can compare it with the new index values that we have. So that would be nice. And Thomas's suggestion on definitely on the linking it to democracy variables is definitely a great idea, and also to support our claim of the importance of political participation of migrants for inclusive and societies and more consolidated democracy. And regarding Genevieve's points on two-way process of integration, it's absolutely very important, and that is our assumption when building these indicators. And actually with MyPix, many of the indicators are based on this two-way process logic, where we actually punish the countries, lower the score of the countries for introducing too many obstacles to access, because we believe it is a two-way process. And you can clearly see that the high-ranking countries are MyPix pretty much are the high ranking of political participation. So there is a correlation between MyPix and the political participation. And actually we have looked into how MyPix correlates with these outcomes too initially, but because political participation was more focused into this form of integration, the results were more robust. And Wally, I'm aware of your research on refugees in Belgium, and I know it will be published soon, and I'm really looking forward to disseminating it also. And I think it's a great idea to add a recommendation to substantiate what's going on behind these numbers. And we have actually, throughout this project of New Europeans Initiative, we have also had several work packages that focus on what is going on actually with migrant-led organizations, what kind of obstacles they're having in participation. And there are a lot of things we're not really capturing with the index, for instance, what's going on with the political parties. And I know that this is something you're looking at because you have interviewed the failed, right? The non-elected members of candidates of elections. So I'm eager to read the results, and definitely we're open to add another recommendation to these. I don't know if we missed anything, but happy to address them maybe at a later point.
I think, sorry, one major point that maybe you missed out is during your survey in the 22 countries, did you get the views of the political parties, their policies on migrant political participation? Thank you.
No, the European Social Survey does not collect any information on this. There are other data sources like the manifesto data, which looks at some of the content of political party discourse on this, and that is also changing. I think this is another way of how this data can be used and merged with this data with a multiple level analysis, because clearly we realize that there are some countries where you would expect, for instance, high efficacy, but probably because we believe that because of the latest negative discourse in politics, people do not report that high engagement, high interest. So we think that could be a reason. And the way we can measure this could be if there is a question in European Social Survey's new round on this, that would be great. If not, maybe it can be merged as a contextual variable on the number of parties with an anti-migration stance, or the share of the political parties, vote share of the political parties with anti-immigrant discourse, which is a lot of parties, unfortunately, now as compared to before. So definitely something that can be looked at. Current data sources did not allow for this.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to come to an end. Thank you so much for your interest and all this input. The next steps, I mean, of course, we will share the presentation of today. There will be a news item on our website. We will incorporate all this feedback into the final report and the final recommendations. And the plan is to launch and publish it in March. Two more announcements from my side. There will be another online event of the initiative on the 17th of February at 1 o'clock, a policy seminar on racial structural discrimination and migrant voice. We will launch a policy brief on that day that looks at political participation of migrants from the angle of structural discrimination. We think this is extremely important, not only to discuss this in terms of integration, inclusion, and democracy deficit, but also really looking at where does structural discrimination come in here. I think we shared the link in the chat box. Please have a look at the agenda. And second, you will receive an email from us inviting you to participate in a survey of the SURF program of the European Union that is making our program possible. Part of this survey is on feedback of the event, part is on democracy in the European Union. Please have a look at that as well. It is really important that the European Commission is getting this feedback to evaluate the program to further develop it. Thank you so much again.
And maybe one last remark: the
Yes.
analysis the final report will come in 2 or 3 different pieces, different publications, and will be available in March with your feedback incorporated into it.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.